give folks a few more minutes to join and then we'll get started. But in the meantime, definitely feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I see a few people have already started. Good afternoon from Phoenix, Arizona. So it's a little bit earlier over there. Hello from Chicago. I'm here in Washington, D.C. Amanda's in Philadelphia. Paolo is in Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn, New York.
I live in Brooklyn, but I'm visiting colleagues in Durham, North Carolina right now, working from the public library here. It's lovely. I love it here.
Oh, very nice. And Lo, where are you based? Can you remind us?
I am in Baltimore, Maryland, as I will sell you the sun again. Baltimore, according to our benches, the greatest place on earth.
Definitely a fun aquarium. Great. Well, it's 3 o'clock. I see we've got 50 people. We'll just give it one more minute just in case folks are hopping on from another meeting. Yes, thank you for sharing your blog post, Amanda. I read it this morning, loved it. Hi, Lisa, nice to see you again. All right, we've got 70 participants. I think that's a great number. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce the webinar. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Implementing the Digital Equity Act, What Workforce and Education Advocates Need to Know About Digital Inclusion, featuring National Skills Coalition and the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this important topic. We are recording the webinar and the slides will be sent out after. Please feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat. We'll also be taking questions at the end, so feel free to use either the Q&A or the chat to write your questions, and we'll go over them at the end of the webinar. So let's get started with some introductions. Please meet our esteemed panelists. First, I'm Caroline Treschitta. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I'm a federal policy analyst with National Skills Coalition. I work on our congressional facing work along with our network and advocacy work. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague and really a leader in the digital literacy space, Senior Fellow Amanda Bergson-Shilcock with National Skills Coalition. And then from the NDIA side, we are joined by Lo Smith, Senior Programs Manager at NDIA. They are new to NDIA within the past few months, have a very rich digital equity and inclusion and library background. We're also joined by Paolo Balboa, who is the Senior Programs and Data Manager at NDIA with a library education and outreach background as well. So thank you all for joining us, and let's get into what the attendees can expect from this webinar. So we'll start off with a little bit about both of our organizations in case we have any folks who are new to either of the organizations. We'll get into a little bit about why we wanted to have this webinar, what brought our organizations together, and really the purpose of it. Next, we'll take a deeper dive into the Digital Equity Act and why it's a really great opportunity for skills advocates. The Digital Equity Act was passed by Congress at the end of last year, so we'll give you the download on what you need to know about it. Next, we'll take a deeper dive into the digital inclusion field. We'll highlight some of the expertise and potential partners in that area. And then I'll wrap us up with how you can take action, what's coming down the federal pipeline, and then we will finish with some Q&A, as I mentioned. So feel free to, again, put any questions that you have in the chat or the Q&A section of the webinar. So first, a little bit of organizational background about National Skills Coalition. If you're new to us, welcome. And again, thanks for joining us. So really at NSC, our core vision is that we believe that jobs that require skills training, which are the majority of jobs in America, are the backbone of our economy. And we really fight for a national commitment to inclusive, high quality skills training so that more people have access to a better life and more local businesses see sustained growth. And I think particularly important in that sentence is the word inclusive. We know that unfortunately, so often many marginalized communities have been underserved by the workforce system. So just ensuring that we are really trying to center the needs of folks who've been historically underserved. Just wanted to pull that out from our vision. We've been around for over 20 years, so since 2000, and we use a combination of analysis and technical assistance, organizing, advocacy, communications, and we change laws and policies at both the state and federal level to grow businesses and economies, and of course, to improve the lives of working people. I think what really makes NSC stand out as an organization is our networks and ensuring our work remains grounded in them. We're connected with folks across the country who are doing work on the ground, like many of the people on the call today. We represent networks including businesses, workers, colleges, community organizations, public officials, and advocates. These folks make up our national network who stay plugged into our federal policy priorities and advocacy opportunities and just our general federal landscape. We also have our state network, which we call SkillSpan. We have those networks in 20 states, and folks come together to advocate for and implement equitable workforce policies. And then finally, we have our Business Leaders United network, which provides a common platform for small and mid-sized businesses to advocate for their skills-based and hiring needs. So that's a little bit about National Skills Coalition, and now I'll turn it over to the NDIA folks to introduce their organization.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Carolyn. And before I start talking about who we are, I just want to say thank you to the National Skills Coalition for inviting myself and Lo to be on to talk about a subject that is very near and dear to our hearts, digital equity and the Digital Equity Act. So my name is Paolo Balboa. As Carolyn said in the intro, I have a background in public libraries and education and outreach. A little bit about who we are as NDIA. We're a unified voice for home and public broadband, personal devices, and local technology training and support programs. We have a network of over 600 affiliates across most of the contiguous United States. We're trying to hit 50 plus the territories sooner than later. But I will say that over the past 2 years, since the pandemic struck, the interest and growth of our community has more than doubled. The same could be said for our staff. When I first joined in the summer of 2020, we were a staff of 4 people. Now in this wonderful photo taken just last month, we bloomed into a group of 17 people, staff members. So our community has grown, but our staffing has grown as well. There's a lot of new interest in the digital equity world, and we are here to provide that backbone of training, support, combining best practices, not only from best practices that we learn from talking with our community, but also to engage our community and to expand the scope of our reach. Digital equity has been a subject that has grown in the past 2 years, as we've seen in the passing of legislation last year. We expect it to continue to grow. So on the next slide, you can see the different types of buckets that our work falls into. We begin with practitioner support, right? That network of over 600 affiliates includes organizations like public libraries, it includes workforce development boards, it includes economic development organizations in rural and urban areas. Anyone who has realized, and again, especially in the past 2 years, that in order to reach their communities, in order to continue working with folks who are in the most need, that they need some sort of internet access and a device and an understanding of how to use that device. Those are the folks who are in our who are in the NDIA community. That first bucket for practitioner support, all of our work is done by talking with folks who are doing this work on the ground. We learn best from you all, right? For the national organization, we can learn from people who are interacting with the work every single day. That further filters into our next bucket, which is for policy, whether that's local, regional, state, or sometimes federal policy. We try to influence policymakers at all levels to consider digital equity and digital inclusion into anything that they do. Sometimes that includes a lot of education on our part to help folks realize that they are actually doing this work, even if they're not necessarily calling it digital equity or digital inclusion. So that transitions into our next bucket, right? For awareness, we're all advocates in this world. Once we get introduced to the topic of digital equity and digital inclusion, once we realize that we have been doing this work, it's like, oh, here's this larger community of practice of folks who think similarly to me about the end goals of the communities that we're working with. Finally, for our last bucket, for data and research, learning from our community, we all have we have some expertise in finding the hard numbers and statistics to back up what we're feeling in our programs in our communities. So to be able to prove that through some data and research that we do with our community members helps expand our breadth as well. So just as far as some table setting for our conversation today, on the next slide you'll see two definitions. These definitions for digital equity and digital inclusion were defined, maybe this is not a big surprise, by and for our community, right? When NDIA first officially registered as a 501c3 in 2015, one of the first things that we did was to ask folks, how do you describe your work, right? We were asking folks like public librarians, we were asking folks who work for workforce development boards. Anyone who sort of did this work, we asked them, how do you define this work? We think it's important to have a shared and similar vocabulary so that we can expand the tent, right? A lot of people are doing this sort of work of digital equity and digital inclusion, but they're not necessarily calling it that. So we start with definitions to ground ourselves. Digital equity and digital inclusion, I like to think of as two phrases that are interrelated with each other, but they're not necessarily the same thing. I like to think of digital equity as the goal, right? We want to get individuals and communities to this place where they have the full information technology capacity to participate in society, democracy, and the economy. What that means in practice, well, just thinking back to 2020, pandemic year, which was also a census taking year, it was also a presidential election year, when everything had to go online in spring of that year, there was this big danger of communities that were already historically underserved further being forgotten about or not counted in a census or not being able to vote in a presidential election because they didn't have that access, or maybe they didn't have the confidence or the skill set to be able to participate. So understanding that we're not quite there, we're not quite at this framework of digital equity, the question then becomes, how do we get people there? What are those necessary components to get communities and individuals to this framework of digital equity? That's digital inclusion. So that those activities necessary for the full participation include affordable home broadband, appropriate devices, digital literacy, tech support, applications, understanding of applications. A holistic digital inclusion program includes or addresses hopefully all of these bullet points. Later on in our piece of today's presentation, we'll be sharing with you some examples of programs that do touch on some, if not all of those bullet points. But on the next slide, you can see those components of digital inclusion broken down into these three areas. So affordable broadband, affordable/appropriate devices, and trainings. Affordable broadband refers to an issue not just of access, but of not just of access and availability, but of asking who does have broadband at home, right? So just because a household has access to a wireline, maybe fiber connection underneath their home, they may not be adopting broadband at home. The question becomes why? Maybe it's too expensive. Maybe this household or homeowner doesn't understand, what they could get out of having a home internet connection. So helping folks understand that gap. Also the issue of affordable and appropriate devices, right? So thinking through, in a skills example of, what it's like to add an attachment to an email, the difference between doing that on a laptop or a desktop versus doing that on a smartphone is worlds apart. That example is an issue of a smartphone maybe not being the appropriate device for an online activity. Finally, digital literacy trainings. So who is there? That's the human element. Who can an individual or community member call on if they need help with any of these other components? Typically, a place like a public library, a public computer center, workforce development folks have been that human element to help bring communities and uplift. So on the next slide, just to add a little bit of data and research backbone to the work that NDIA does. There's a big disparity between who and who isn't connected, right? You may have heard of the urban and rural divide, not only in a digital divide context, but in other sort of categories of community health. What we at NDIA are trying to do is trying to describe this as an urban and rural problem, right? The issue of internet access, the issue of appropriate devices, and the issue of digital literacy trainings are issues that affect both folks in rural areas and folks in urban areas. So we're not trying to separate these populations anymore, because the issue of internet access, if COVID has taught us anything, is an issue that affects everyone across the country, right? And we're trying and continuing to work to close that digital divide. So I'll send it back to my colleagues at the National Skills Coalition to talk about why this webinar.
Thanks so much, Paolo. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. So why are we here? We're here for two reasons. The most immediate reason is that in November, Congress passed the Digital Equity Act, and we know that our members are keenly eager to hear more about this $2.75 billion in funding that will be coming to US communities. But in the context of hearing about that, we want you to know more about the digital inclusion field. And that's why we're partnering with NDIA for today's webinar. NDIA members are in communities across the country, as you've just heard. And so our goal today is to make sure that adult higher education and workforce development leaders are connected with digital inclusion advocates, that we flag some upcoming opportunities that are coming down the pike with Digital Equity Act implementation, including every state's digital equity planning process, which will be kicking off this summer and will last about 12 months. Encouraging you to collaborate with state government leaders on state policy as appropriate. And then you'll be hearing from Caroline a little bit later on specific federal advocacy opportunities, right? Because this critically important funding that we see under the Digital Equity Act is incredibly important in supporting foundational digital skills. But we know there's more for Congress to do on industry-specific digital skills. And a lot of that comes out of NSC's own research and conversations with all of you in the field about the ways in which you have and have not been able to find funding to support the kinds of skills training that your organizations would like to do. In the next slide, we've just recapped some of the recent ways that you've taken action and engaged on these issues. Many of you chimed in as we were developing public comments to the federal government, to the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, not to be confused with the nonprofit NDIA. And those comments, that 15-page set of comments, were submitted in February. I've linked the blog post here in this slide. You'll get these slides in email after today's webinar, so you'll be able to click on all these links, follow up on any of these resources, and we'll be sharing them in the chat as well so that you have them for easy reference. We also know that many of you showed up at a webinar that we had right before the Christmas holidays to give you a quick overview of what was in the Digital Equity Act, and earlier webinars we had in 2021 and 2020, recapping our research on digital literacy and digital skills writ large. Many of you also joined us just last month for a session at our Skills Summit featuring Senator Tim Kaine and other high-level leaders, including Portia Wu of Microsoft, talking about digital skills and industry-specific digital skills. And of course, many of you also engaged in our state level policy recommendations. So there have been lots of ways that workforce and education leaders have been engaging on these issues. And I hope that following today's webinar, you'll be able to roll up your sleeves and identify some really practical additional next steps so that you can engage as advocates on these issues. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to colleagues now as we move into the next section of our conversation, in which our team members at NDIA will be delving into the actual content of the Digital Equity Act and giving you a briefing of the different funding streams that will be coming down under this legislation.
Yes. So this is the time that I will start to talk about some numbers. If you are not a numbers person, I definitely would recommend taking a look at some of the stuff visually on our website later, but also, you know, just breathe through it. Lots of big numbers here, which is what's exciting. And an apology to Andrew and Paul. This may not apply to you in the UK and New Zealand, but hopefully this will give you a little bit of context to know what we're doing over here and hopefully what you'll be able to do in the future. A little bit of context on the Digital Equity Act. So this is part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I think we've all heard about. It's been really exciting. And just to give those big numbers to everybody to show the context of where this Digital Equity Act is, that whole thing, the IIJA, 65 billion. The Digital Equity Act is 2.75 billion of that. The Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program is 42.5 billion. The Affordable Connectivity Program, which is definitely something I recommend you check out. We don't have time to cover it here because it's such an exciting thing, but I would love for y'all to view some of our resources on it, is 14.2 billion. There's also a tribal connectivity program for 2 billion and a middle mile connectivity program for 1 billion, as well as a section discussing digital discrimination. So this is really exciting stuff. At the time that all of this was being written and created, I was not a member of NDIA, but Paolo was, so he has ridden the emotional journey that is watching some of the wild ideas that have been kicked around in our community for a while become billion-dollar numbers. So that's a little bit of the context on all of that. On the next slide, we are going to talk about specifically how the 1.5 billion combined of these state planning grants and state capacity grants work. So within the Digital Equity Act, 1.5 billion of that is going towards these two different types of state grants, with the exception of our dear friends in other countries. And I think some territories will also be eligible. Most territories will be eligible for state grants as well. There is money that will be set aside, and this money is specifically for the states. Big important thing to think about here is how each state will be handling this. Depending on where you're located, there will be different places and different people that will be managing these. One really important action item, so if you're going to write one thing down, don't write down a number, write down this. Find out who will be handling the state grants within your state. Send them an email. Now is the time to get to know the folks who are going to be in charge of ensuring that these funds are equitably distributed throughout the state, throughout all of the communities that are really in need of access, and appropriate devices, internet, and digital skills. So all of these funds will be available for all three of those topics and the 5 parts that Paolo talked about under digital inclusion. But those funds will be handled by each state individually, which is really cool, but also can be a little bit tough because I would love to be able to give one specific instruction to everyone and say, locate your broadband office and speak to them. Some of your states may have a broadband office. Some of your states may not actually have a broadband office. So it may be up to you to figure out exactly where these funds are going to be held and how they will be distributed. The first set, so on the next slide, we have the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program. The reason there's so much text on this slide is for you to look at later. I'm going to run through it pretty quickly because there's a lot to think about here, and it's going to be big, and there are still some big questions that we're thinking about. But this is the one where you're going to figure out who's administering this and what's going to happen with it. So these are going to be allocated at a very specific method, and this is where I do recommend looking up more on this. I will go over some of it, but not all of it. There are eligible administering entities, so folks who will be able to participate in this structure, and specifically take a look where it says workforce development programs, and partnerships between preceding entities, including states, foundations, corporations. So there will be funding that will be available to fund specific programming, access, and advocacy for different communities. And we've got the covered populations. We're really trying to prioritize folks who have been left out of the digital inclusion experience. On the next slide, this is where I want to really focus a little bit on who our communities are that we are already serving collectively. I feel like I'm kind of talking to my people on this call because I have a feeling that you guys are librarians. I was a workforce librarian. I was an outreach librarian. And thank you, Amanda, for that context. This is the formula funding that will go to every state. And we are focused on specific populations that are requiring additional support. And this is one of the ways that I like to frame this, because we have been out here providing a lot of resources over time, many of which have been digital skills based, but there is a specific amount. So the capacity grants are for 25% of the covered member population. So that's who we're focusing. 25% must be serving these specific communities. And for those of us, I think I saw a lot of English language learner communities and folks in here, also folks who are working in primarily rural areas, as well as below the federal poverty line. Definitely some folks who mentioned aging, I believe, disabilities, language barriers, etc. So this is really thinking about developing plans and methods for moving forward. So on the next slide, we can talk a little bit about within this state digital equity capacity grant program. This is about developing the plan for how to address digital inequity within your state. And this is where we all can have a voice to participate. Yes, there is funding coming forward, but even before we know where the money will be and how it will be involved, it's up to all of us as advocates for our own communities. And when I say us, I'm thinking about myself still as a librarian. I was a librarian for 9 years. I developed a bit of a reputation for fighting for my community strongly. So when I say us, I'm talking about us, me as a librarian back then. So getting involved within these state digital equity plans for considering how this funding will be used, bringing that a specific need and saying, I'm here to represent my community of folks, and we will require this, and here is how we would like support for it moving forward. And this is where being able to identify those specific barriers that the folks we've been serving are facing when it comes to digital inclusion is awesome. Many of us have firsthand knowledge of the specific needs of our communities, and we can speak to that. Once we have established who will be taking place, who will be engaging within the state digital equity plans, within that capacity grant program, we can begin to speak up and say, we know we have needs. We know we have communities that deserve and desire this funding. Here's what we think we can do. And then being able to start there and follow through on the entire process over the next 2 years. I am a person who always shows up early. I think everybody managing this call knows that I logged in a little early. So this is the time to show up early and be able to follow that whole journey all the way down. Speaking of a timeline, on my next slide, we can take a look at this timeline that is a little, it's a little confusing for some folks. So the request for comments has actually already taken place. I should have updated that because it's always said soon to me, because that's always how it's felt. But we did mention that the comments were submitted. And then there are specific timelines for when these notice of funding opportunities will take place, application windows, the plan developments, and then when those capacity grants will be awarded afterwards. What we want to talk about specifically within this timeline is both the planning development and also sort of the notice of funding. Those are times to really pay attention, to reach out within your states, within your communities, within your regions, and to start building those connections so that we don't wake up after the plan development with the capacity grants being issued and going, oh, you know, if we had mentioned this a little bit earlier, we think we could have done something really cool with a partner org, or this would have been awesome. I wish I'd gotten in a little earlier. I wish I'd showed up a little earlier. I wish I'd heard about it. So this is also a great time to spread a little bit of awareness. The good news is with the National Skills Coalition and NDIA, we are going to be shouting very loudly when the notice of funding comes out, when the application windows open. So stay ready for those notifications. Be prepared for the moment that we are saying, go, go, go. Because as you can see, 180 days for the notice of funding opportunities. There's an application window for 60 days that will be handled by the states. But you want those states to know who you are, even when they're writing those applications, even a little bit beforehand. It's time to build the friendships and build the networks. And then on the next slide, there is also then the competitive grant program. And this one is a little bit different. And this is going to be significantly handled slightly differently than everything else. But so you're looking at two different programs is the most important thing to remember. They work together. They are complementary. I like to think of them as like the Venn diagrams that are pretty much a circle, but also not. Maybe that wasn't the best example. But this is one that we are looking at that's going to be handled more very specifically through states, tribal organizations, similar to the other one, but you can tell those numbers are a little bit different. And we're also looking at 5 years of time. To think about the digital equity field and the digital inclusion field over the last 5 years is huge. Paolo mentioned that NDIA only was officially formed in 2015. It is now 7 years later, and the level of work that we have put forth in that time and the growth we have seen from our community and the work that we've been able to support has been phenomenal. So thinking about this breakdown for over 5 years is huge. I always want to make sure that we are thinking very immediately, but we also understand that there is a very, very big future ahead of us together and separately as we work on different projects and specifically covering the different areas within the access, affordable devices, and skills. On the next page, we can take a look at how these funds will be used. So to support not less than one of the following activities. I kind of love that phrase because it encourages us to collaborate and to see how we can serve multiple different communities at the same time, how we can ensure that everything is taking place in a cohesive manner. Also, please let me know if you can hear jackhammers outside. That is the sound of infrastructure taking place in my neighborhood. Paolo says no, but if it's bugging you, do let me know. I'll close the window. So this is again to develop and implement digital inclusions to benefit covered populations, to facilitate broadband adoption. And here's the one that you've all been waiting for, to implement training programs for covered populations that cover basic, advanced, or applied skills or workforce development programs. But it's also about getting the physical stuff that you need to be able to participate in these activities. I think all of us know that quite often, the biggest thing that we run into whenever we have been working with our communities, whether it's for any level of education, is providing that education, but also the infrastructure to get it there, the device, the connectivity, or even just the communication styles. So this is pretty similar to the other grant system, but I just wanted to sort of differentiate it as well. For the timeline for this one is similarly wonderfully murky, yet we have action items. So on the next slide, we can take a look at this. So after the capacity grants come out, those first ones, that's when the competitive grant program will start. This is also wonderfully staggered because it does allow us, should we have perhaps missed an opportunity earlier, maybe we're an organization that just formed. Maybe we're an organization that's taking a new form and really deciding that now is the time to expand our digital inclusion work. And yes, we'd like to participate. So there are multiple opportunities. This will be coming out after the first grant setting. And this is also one where we will be shouting out when these funding opportunities are coming up. We will be shouting out when states are receiving funding and then trying to promote when each state will be announcing their different timelines. So it's going to be a little scattered as the 50 states and 10 plus territories will be handling this individually, but this is something to set your Google alerts for and also get prepared to really think about who will I be talking to within my state or territory to ensure that we are thinking about digital skills and skills development who are the partners that I could engage with, as I can provide skills development, but who can I work with to ensure that devices are provided for as well, that access to affordable broadband is there, so that we can kind of team up and see what we can do together and begin sort of the brainstorming and education process far before this becomes something that we all have to immediately go for. I think many of us have experienced the world of engaging with a grant when it is due in a few days and trying to develop and refine the way that we want to describe our work and fit that grant. Because we're all here today, we're not going to end up in a competitive scramble. Instead, we're going to end up in a collaborative ecosystem of folks working together to ensure that all of this funding goes to support the covered populations as well as the rest of the populations, that the money is equitably distributed from, it will be starting with our governors and then expanding throughout the state. So from our governors to the administering offices, and then to ensure that the folks that we need to see served are being served. And that we have as much stakeholder engagement as we can get. So asking our clients, our customers, our patrons, whatever we call our participants, our students, what they may need, so that when we've got a grand idea, we're ready to go. And I think, let me see if there's anything more, but I think this is back when I pass it off to say, well, what does this really mean for the skills advocates? I gave you a little bit of it, but I might have stepped on some toes. I got excited.
No, that's what collaboration's all about. So I think we're in great shape here. I'm going to reiterate what we've been talking about in the comments, right? What are your immediate next steps, your action items, as Lo was just describing? Absolutely, this is the time to connect with your governor's office, figure out who your governor's office is appointing as the administering entity, the state agency or other entity that's going to be in charge of your state digital equity planning process. This is absolutely the time to get to the table starting later this spring and early summer to be part of your state's digital equity planning process. And that's also the time when you can sort of jump up and down and make a big amount of noise about the covered populations that the digital equity plan really needs to be explicit about how it's serving. So if you're passionate about rural communities or passionate about low-income communities or folks who are English language learners, or go on down the list, the digital equity plan is your first moment to really make sure those folks are front and center in having a voice for what digital equity means for them, their communities, so that when that digital equity plan is later used to shape the state's funding decisions, you were in on the ground floor helping to do that. And of course, there are lots of innovative things that your state can do without even waiting for the feds to get going on the digital equity planning process. And I've linked one here in the slide. It's also linked in that blog post that I dropped in the chat earlier about Hawaii's really innovative digital readiness survey that they did of state residents. In the next slide, we have just a few more resources to share with you. Some of you have seen these before, but we have a report on boosting digital literacy in the workplace. We have 4 different fact sheets on digital skills by industry sector, and you can use these to sort of connect the dots for your governor's office, for your state agencies, to say, whatever it is that you care about, if you care about the manufacturing sector, if you care about getting people back to work, you should be thinking about how the Digital Equity Act plays nicely with the workforce and economic development investments that your state is making. This is a really, prime moment for that. There's a lot of money in the infrastructure bill that goes beyond even the $65 billion that Lo was talking about for broadband infrastructure and into other workforce development and other programs. So this is a great moment to make sure that they're all kind of rowing in the same direction. And we have, I think, one more resource on the next slide before I turn it back over to our friends at NDIA. This was our kind of baseline report, has lots of charts and graphs about foundational digital skills. We warmly encourage you to steal these charts and graphs, use them in your own grant applications, use them in your own public presentations, use them in your own advocacy with policymakers. Just credit National Skills Coalition. But these charts and graphs are really here for you to be able to illustrate at a glance why these issues are so important, right? A lot of people had an aha moment in March of 2020 when the pandemic hit, and policymakers and journalists and school officials and everyone suddenly realized that whatever it was they cared about couldn't happen without digital inclusion. If people didn't have broadband, didn't have devices, and didn't have skills, they couldn't access telehealth appointments, they couldn't get a job, they couldn't do safety training so they could get called back from furlough to their job, they couldn't help their kids with school, it goes on and on, right? And so these charts and graphs are really to help you connect the dots between the workforce and adult education and higher education worlds and the digital inclusion worlds. I'm going to turn things back over to our NDIA colleagues for a couple slides, then you'll hear briefly from Caroline, and then we'll open it up for questions. But I'm also going to encourage you to keep sharing your questions in the chat. We're more than happy to answer questions in all modalities here. So back over to you at NDIA.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so I'll just build upon a point that Amanda was touching on just now about connecting the dots. That's really the I think one of the strong points of our organization, to get folks to talk with each other who may not consider talking with each other, right? As the national organization, we can have that connection thread between different types of organizations and also new organizations who may not consider their work as being defined as digital equity or digital inclusion. So at NDIA, because we're a small but mighty and growing nonprofit organization, you'll notice that we like to reuse some content. So on the next slide, you're going to see a slide that I use and lean on quite frequently. You all have already seen this just 20 minutes ago, but I want to talk about this slide in the context of digital inclusion programming. Before COVID, we saw a lot of programs in the digital equity, digital inclusion world that touched on maybe one or two of these components here. Thinking about in public libraries, because that's my background, thinking about in public libraries, a Wi-Fi hotspot lending program or a laptop lending program. That's great, right? It's important to get connectivity for folks who need home connectivity. It's great to get devices in the hands of folks who don't have a home, who don't have a home computer, or maybe can't afford a home computer. What happens then if that person gets a laptop for a checkout period of 4 weeks, but they don't understand how to use it, right? It's not addressing those three holistic points of digital inclusion. So what we're trying to do now in the post-COVID world is to describe programs as a holistic addressing of all of these components of digital inclusion. On the next slide, we're going to talk about a program that we've been piloting for the past year and a half called Digital Navigators. Digital Navigators is a program that was first piloted at the Salt Lake City Public Library through their library's department that addressed computer training, technology training programs. So they were working only with one of those components, digital literacy trainings. They were the experts. Their digital navigators knew how to deliver content to community members in a way that community members understood, but the library hadn't yet taken on those other components for devices and home connectivity. Digital Navigators is a program that builds upon the existing strengths of places like public libraries, places like economic development organizations, and places like workforce development boards, to build upon their strengths, but just to include those other components of digital inclusion. Digital Navigators was designed to be a flexible model. So on our website, which my colleague Lo can drop in the chat, there are a number of free resources. They are open. We want you to take them. We want you to replicate them and adapt them towards your own, towards the unique uses of your organization. We've seen over the past 2 years, Digital Navigators as a program take many lives. So beyond living in a place like a public library, we've most recently worked with the state of Massachusetts workforce development organization called Mass Hire. We've also worked with another type of digital navigator program in the state of Ohio that's specifically focused on workforce development for older adults in this case meaning 55 plus. The digital navigator organization in that case was called Vantage Aging, who received money from the Department of Labor. But we've also seen digital navigators work through other different types of organizations like the San Diego City of Parks and Recreation. right? So all of these types of organizations, all of these different threads collectively were realizing, maybe on their own time, that they needed digital inclusion to continue doing their work, to continue connecting with communities. So as Lo was mentioning a few slides ago in the competitive grant program, digital inclusion programming is an eligible and very much part of what you can do with this pot of money coming down the pike. So I'll send it on to Lo, who will talk in the next few slides about digital inclusion ecosystems. Lo?
Yep, sweet. So thank you. This is the part where I tell everybody, all 136 of us and 5 panelists, that we're part of a digital inclusion ecosystem. Whether you know it or not, you are participating in some activity that is creating a digital inclusion ecosystem in your community. One of the biggest things to do right now are to find the other parts of that ecosystem. For anybody who took biology, it's a lot of just kind of looking around and feeling. When we talk about ecosystems, we look up, we look down, and we look sideways. So those are some of the ways that I like to describe the ways that we can find the other people who are participating in these ecosystems. Some examples are the folks who are developing programs and policies. They're part of that ecosystem. That may be you. There are folks who are creating the affordable and subsidized programs for devices and broadband, and that may be something that you're doing in conjunction to other work. Perhaps you handed out devices early on for a skills training and allowed community members to maintain them. Those devices have taken on a life of their own. They are most likely still in the hands of or in the households of the folks who are using them and helping to meet the needs of a number of different people within that household. Some other parts of the ecosystem include the digital skills trainings that meet the community's needs, multilingual, but also I like to think about accessible as well. Workforce does not always mean able-bodied. Workforce does not always mean that you are able to work with the tools that you are given. It does not always mean that you have a high level of literacy. So making sure that those digital skills trainings are coming in a format that is applicable to the community who requires them, and that we're also able to uplift other skills with them as well. On the next slide, we can see a few more of our pieces of our ecosystem that we can reach out to. Of course, the hardware and software technical support. One of the things that is fantastic about a program like a digital navigator or another one is the fact that often we have our device, we have our home internet, we know how to use it, and when we get the blue screen of death, we give up forever. I think everybody on this webinar has seen the blue screen of death before. You know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't, I would like to know who you are and how you've gotten this far in the world of technology without it. But thinking about how do we make sure that people are able to maintain and use those devices for a long period of time? How are we making sure that they have the support to maintain their devices and to do some basic troubleshooting at work? One of the major pieces of becoming that person in the office or in the warehouse that everybody goes to is knowing how to fix everything. So a certain level of hardware and software technical support can give you some of those skills, but also know when it's time to talk to somebody who has those skills instead. Also, digital navigation services to guide residents through all of these things above. You may be providing this already, or this may be an opportunity to work to find an organization that either can do it or is doing it now. Make that connection, find that new best friend. And this all comes down to collaboration. This is how we get the ecosystem. This is how the rain comes up, or the water evaporates and the rain comes down. We're looking for all of these entities to get connected and to really collaborate. Sometimes when we're thinking about that slide that we saw twice, we have the 3 different categories. And one of the things I will say to organizations not as established as we all are on this webinar, not as established as everyone who's watching this later on, it's okay to just do one. And plenty of us are just doing one. We've picked the one we can excel at, that we can provide a quality service in. But that's when it's time to find folks who are doing the other things. And if just doing one of those aspects, if digital skills, that's I think most of our skill sets here, then it's time to really start reaching out to find who are folks who are providing devices in our community, and taking a look at some of the resources through NDIA that we have on our website that I will drop into the chat in a minute after this, figuring out where you can find devices, learning about low-cost internet within your area, and figuring out who are the folks who are already doing this a little bit better than I am, or is it time to have somebody in-house? who can handle the navigation, that's where we really begin to see that digital equity ecosystem, the digital inclusion taking place that is moving us forward. So thinking about it, I've called it a circle, I've called it a lot of different things, but an ecosystem is my favorite way to think about it, because the thing that I think about an ecosystem is it's sustainable. It keeps going, and the more that it works together and doubles down with itself, the better it becomes. So when we think about our collaboration, our friendships, our preparations, and our networking, think about working together, coming together to build and become better. And now we pass it off to Caroline.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we've heard a lot about Digital Equity Act, digital inclusion, how you can get plugged in. And I really just want to offer a picture of some other policies that are coming down the federal pipeline, where you also are encouraged and welcome to plug in, that maybe address some additional areas of digital inclusion that aren't quite yet addressed by the Digital Equity Act. So first, just really a picture of some of the congressional advocacy we've been doing around digital equity and what we have coming up. To start, Amanda mentioned National Skills Coalition recently hosted our largest virtual flying event of the year, our big federal advocacy event, the Skills Summit, which accumulated in around 130 virtual Hill meetings. And really our first ask was around investment, and specifically calling out investments in these digital literacy programs, digital equity, et cetera. We had folks in these meetings raising how they were able to use CARES dollars, American Rescue Plan dollars, and more to provide digital literacy programs. And of course, again, highlighting that the Digital Equity Act will allow them to do more of this, but really raise for policymakers how digital literacy is an intrinsic part of workforce and therefore needs to be included in further investments. So all of that's to say is policymakers are really primed for the importance of digital literacy. That message will be continued during our first in-person event in many years, where business leaders will deliver that same message to Congress. And the idea there is really so Congress can hear from both perspectives, both skills advocates and business leaders, that this is an essential issue. I've put the hashtags in the slides as well in case you're interested in following along or catching up on Twitter. I also want to lift up the ways in which we are plugging in and engaging Congress around this topic area. The first one, as I just mentioned, is investment. Congress just passed and the president signed into law the federal appropriations bill for this year, which included modest increases in investments across workforce programs. But we know, of course, that the continued disinvestment in programs in workforce across the past 2 decades, really more investment is needed to bring the workforce system up to the scope and scale needed to truly serve workers and students inclusively and equitably, and to compete with our global partners on that scale as well. So we know that by investing more in workforce programs, this will give folks the funds and the flexibility they need to create and carry out the digital literacy programs. And I'll drop a link to some more information about that bill in just a moment. The other, we've already sort of touched on a bit, but I'll just call out a little bit more, is highlighting the importance of partnerships, and specifically industry sector partnerships. We know that partnerships between industry and training providers are crucial for creating digital programs that lead to in-demand jobs within sectors in your communities. We've been highlighting the importance of these partnerships and how they can create strong digital literacy programs for Congress. And if additional ones come out of the Digital Equity Act, we'd love to highlight those as well. And we're going to continue to do so, especially as we have WIOA reauthorization coming down the pipeline. These negotiations are a little bit slow, but happening a bit quicker on the House side. So we've been ensuring that digital literacy is a topic that comes up in these negotiations again and again. And again, just really making sure that the relationship between workforce and digital equity is seen by policymakers. And that brings me to my final point, which is perhaps the most timely and upcoming portion, the Jobs Act. The Jobs Act is a bipartisan bill with Senator Portman from Ohio and Senator Kaine from Virginia that would expand federal financial aid through Pell Grants to short-term, high-quality training programs. The House recently passed an amendment with the Jobs Act through the Competes Act, and then the Senate passed a version of this bill last summer called USICA, or the China Competitiveness Bill, you might have heard it called. Both these bills aim to bolster the technology and manufacturing sectors. So now the two versions of the bill will move to conference, and we have a sign-on letter going around to encourage Congress to keep the Jobs Act in the final version of that bill. And then how this relates to the people on this call, we know that short-term training programs are really essential for digital literacy programs, whether they are exclusively about digital literacy or include a digital literacy training component in the construction, manufacturing, technology, healthcare fields. They can lead to strong career pathways. And there are also some really great quality assurance components in the latest version of the bill, including programs reporting wage progression of participants after 6 months of completion of programs. And again, this bill will help workers enter into high demand fields and rapidly reskill, and it can help small and mid-sized businesses access a larger pool of talent to meet hiring needs. So overall, an important bill for workforce advocates. Hope you can sign on to the sign-on letter by March 31st, as negotiations will be going on in Congress in the coming weeks and months. So now on to other opportunities that are coming down the pipeline for federal advocacy. As I mentioned, we have the sign-on letter. If you are particularly interested in the short-term Pell issue and would like to get plugged into other components of our advocacy campaign, please email me and I'll get you the right information. We'd love to have some digital advocates, making the case to Congress. Amanda and I also have a digital equity, what we're calling our summit sequel, where we'll be taking a deeper dive into this issue. That'll be the week of August 8th. So we'll highlight some great state examples from our network and update you all with the newest information. And then finally, there is potentially a new legislative vehicle coming down the pipeline towards the end of the summer that will be focused on sort of the upskilling and reskilling and industry-specific components of digital literacy. So please stay plugged in with us so we can get everyone's input on the bill and make sure it works for your communities. And then again, I mentioned WIOA reauthorization, but definitely we're going to keep you all aware of how that impacts your programs and how digital literacy will be woven into that specifically. So overall, please stay plugged in with us. We'd love to hear from you and keep you aware of what we have going on. And with that, I think that brings us to the end of our webinar, and we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Great, and thanks to all of you who've been adding questions in the chat as we've been going. We will collect the links that have been shared in the chat and make sure that those get sent out to you along with the slides and the recording from today's webinar. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. I'd love to hear any final questions or reflections in the chat that folks want to share. You have a couple minutes to do that, so please go ahead and drop those thoughts in there, reactions. If you have unanswered questions that we should tackle in our next webinar, we should absolutely hear those now, so please feel free to get them out. Caroline, thank you for sharing the Jobs Act. I see we have San Francisco shouting us out. Thank you, San Francisco. Thank you, Hawaii. Thank you to all the far-flung folks who joined us today, as well as the folks a little closer to home. I want to just again express my appreciation to NDIA for their partnership and collaboration. Here at the National Skills Coalition, many of us know it took 11 years for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act to get reauthorized. Last time we were trying to get WIOA reauthorized. And it is a joy and a delight that the Digital Equity Act went from 2 years, from being introduced in 2019 to being passed in 2021. But I know that there were many, many years of groundwork that happened before that legislation even got introduced. And many of our friends at NDIA were part of leading that effort. Thank you all for chiming in the chat. We appreciate your appreciation. Thank you for joining us. You know how to reach us. We've put our email addresses in the last couple of slides. So if for any reason you want to follow up after today with any of the presenters, you'll be able to reach us. Paolo did drop in the information on signing up for NDIA's listserv, which I can personally vouch for as a great resource. There will be lots more information coming down the pike from the federal government. And so I do encourage you to sign up for both of our organization's mailing lists so that as that new information is coming out, you can make sure to stay apprised of it. Thanks so much for joining. We're going to go ahead and wrap up now, and we will see you all again on a webinar soon. Take care.